Why didn't 18th century armies with muskets use bulletproof shields? This is a reply to Brandon F. I'll put a link to his video down in the comments below, and he raises a number of great points. He talks about the utility of the shield, and then he also talks in terms of like tactics and strategy, and he also talks about the logistics. And I think when we think about these things, it's important to look at the context. I think Brandon raises a number of great points. People in Europe knew about shields. They almost certainly tried out these sorts of things, and they fought against people who had shields. So it's not like this idea never came up in European warfare with muskets. They knew what shields were. They fought against people who used shields, and they definitely considered shields. And I think one of the best ways to understand why shields weren't much in use in Europe is to look at where they were used. Brandon, right away in his video, brought up a point about Spanish cavalry. And when he was talking about could they make a bulletproof shield, he talked about the breastplates or cuirasses of cavalry soldiers that were in use during the period and were bulletproofed. Perhaps not against a large caliber musket at close range, certainly not against cannon, but at further ranges against muskets or against pistols, they worked. And they were tested. we have archaeological evidence that they were tested. That's what bulletproofing means. They shot them. That's how they knew it worked. So why not shields? And I think the examples where people did use bulletproof objects really show us the situations where that makes sense, and also maybe why it doesn't make sense for everyone. So the Spanish did use shields, they obviously thought it was a good idea. However, if you think for just a moment about cavalry in this period, okay, they want you to have a sword or a lance. They want you to have maybe a couple of pistols or a carbine. Oh, and also they want you to hold on to the reins of the horse. And if you've got a shield, especially a heavy shield that can stop bullets, that's just gonna weigh you down. You're not gonna want to have a shield on the back of a horse, especially when we all know that technology was available. They could essentially just give you a bulletproof vest. There are some disadvantages with shields. Obviously, the shield is only on one side of the body. It can move around. It has some advantages over the bulletproof vest. Cover your head, those kinds of things. But again, it takes one of your hands out of the fight. And in an era where people would have preferred to hold a pistol in one hand, a sword in the other, and grip the reins with their teeth. The cavalry already wanted 3 or 4 hands if they could get them, and taking one out of the fight for a big heavy shield, most militaries at that time decided that it wasn't worth it, that was their line of thinking at the time. And so when we think about this, okay, so that's the situation where it would make sense, and the reason it makes sense in those situations is because first of all, the horse is carrying the breastplate or cuirass or the shield that's carrying you. You can have much bigger, heavier weapons and armor when you're on a horse than when you're walking around on foot. That's just, the horse can carry just a lot more than a person can for much longer distances. It basically deals with the logistic problem, so that you can have additional protection. And then the other thing that I think illustrates why shields weren't used, um, they weren't used in cavalry. Basically, they could have used shields. The shields were used by some armies at some time, but the reason they weren't conventionally adopted is because people found that having a pistol in the other hand was of more use to them, especially when they had a bulletproof vest. The bulletproof breastplate was sufficient armor protection. The shield would have provided more and perhaps better in certain situations, but again, not really worth the trade-off in terms of what the cavalry was doing. Especially for the cavalry, because when they're at the range where you would want to have a shield, it would be really important to both have your sword ready and also be able to discharge one last volley of pistol before you crash into a row of bayonets or enemy cavalry, whatever. So yeah, and also at this time, more and more in the era of firearms, it was common for cavalry to ride somewhere really quickly, dismount, and then fight as infantry. And there again, the heavy shield becomes an issue, and you're going to want to use your hands for carrying other things, like other weapons. There's a couple other scenarios where I know that shields were not necessarily used by Europeans, but by people the Europeans fought against, and why the Europeans wouldn't necessarily adopt shields in those circumstances. And the two situations that I can think of where Europeans definitely would have faced shields on the battlefield are colonial troops. And they would have had shield-bearing allies. A lot of times these colonial troops, their approach was to divide and conquer. They didn't try to go in and attack everyone in a particular colony. Their plan was to ally with certain groups and then use their forces as leverage to gain territory. And so they had native allies. They had native troops. That was really commonplace. It wasn't the case everywhere at all times, but definitely European armies would have had allies who used shields. And so they could have made them bulletproof shields. And that probably would have worked. However, I still think there's some issues there. And the two that I can think of right off the bat is that those shields would have been heavier than what the natives were used to. And one of the advantages of having native allies was using them as scouts, having them help you carry all of your weapons and food and ammunition that your military needed. And if you're weighing them down with these big bulletproof shields, they're not going to be that fast mobile force that you were counting on. Again, probably because for the most part they weren't on horseback, especially if they were if the native allies were infantry. Giving them a big heavy shield to carry just complicates their lives. And the other thing that I think is important to consider is that in many cases these native allies really wanted muskets, and those muskets actually were really useful in the native style of warfare, where you didn't necessarily have a huge supply train like Western armies did, where you did a lot of long-range scouting, where you did a lot of long-range patrols, because if you have a smoothbore musket, you can load it with birdshot, you can load it with buckshot. It doesn't just have to be a giant musket ball for shooting at the enemy. You can use it to hunt along the way, especially small games like rabbit and birds that are very difficult to hit with a bow or with a spear. And again, that style of rapid deployment warfare is really well suited to muskets. Muskets were prized trade goods. People wanted to get their hands on these muskets, and so could you forge a bulletproof shield for these native allies? Yes, you could, but that wasn't really what they wanted. They wanted a musket anyway, and that would better integrate them with your forces. Your forces are trained in musket warfare. You don't know as much about shield warfare. They know about shield warfare, sure, but if you're hoping to integrate those native allies into your forces and use them as your commanders understand how to use forces, then giving them muskets is the best way to accomplish that. The other situation where I believe that European forces would have encountered shields in combat would be at sea. And I believe that several cultures used shields in seagoing warfare, and that and there here I think that a lot of Brandon's points bring up what the problems with using shields at sea would have been. So yeah, they had boarding pikes, they had boarding axes, they had cutlasses, they had pistols and carbines, and they had grape shot. And there's a number of problems. Okay, so maybe a shield would be really useful in a boarding action, but would it? Because you run into a number of the problems that Brandon raised. First, you have a limited number of troops at sea. So you only have so many people. So devoting some of them to carrying a shield limits a significant amount of your offensive capacity. Again, they could have a cutlass in one hand and a pistol in the other and have a much more offensive capacity than they would have by having a shield in one hand and a pistol in the other. And then the other thing is these shields would have decreased in effectiveness at close range. And everything in a boarding action is going to be close range. So the shields aren't going to be as effective. First of all, no shield, even like a Roman scutum style, covers everything. And so if you're at 10 paces or whatever, it's not terribly difficult for the enemy to shoot you in the head, shoot you in the foot, shoot you in your outstretched arm that has a pistol in it, those kinds of things. So there's a bunch of limitations for the physical size of the shield, as opposed to having a different weapon. And then also, the closer the range is, the heavier the shield will have to be to consistently withstand the force of a musket ball. And I don't think any of them would have withstood grape shot. It just wouldn't have worked. Something coming out of a cannon is just much too high a velocity, and no shield is going to protect you from that. And so in those cases, yeah, there's problems with shields in that particular instance. However, I think you could have tried to give native allies bulletproof shields. You could have tried to use shields in seafaring warfare. And given that Europeans definitely would have encountered other people doing this, I imagine that there were some tests and trials done. People must have experimented with this. I'm sure at some point some European picked up a native shield in the heat of battle and used it to good effect. But overall, these bulletproof shields didn't fit in really much of anywhere in the system. If you had something that was capable of carrying a really heavy shield, like a ship or a horse, for the most part, you were in a group that really wanted to have more hands free. You wanted to have, if you're whether you're a sailor or you're in the cavalry, you want to have a sword and a pistol. And giving up either of those things really limits your offensive capacity. And other than protecting you against bullets, in a lot of ways, a sword provides a defensive capability much like a shield. Is it as good as a shield? No, because it doesn't deflect arrows. It doesn't deflect bullets. But swords can be used to keep people at bay in a boarding action. They can be used to fend off a musket with a bayonet on the end of it. So it wasn't like they were completely useless. And at the time, both cutlasses and cavalry swords would have had large protective handguards. So, not necessarily, it's not a shield, but kind of like a little tiny buckler. And so they had protection in place where it made sense. And so, yeah, I think that it's worth thinking about these things. It's worth exploring them. And then it's also worth thinking, okay, obviously they knew what shields were. Obviously they could make things bulletproof. Why didn't they do this? And for the most part, it's that if they were in a situation where the weight didn't matter, then having a free hand mattered a lot. And or in a situation where the weight didn't matter, the native allies preferred to have muskets because muskets were useful in their daily lives, not just on the battlefield, where the bulletproof shield doesn't have a lot of utility in terms of a hunter-gatherer society, other than warfare. So, what do you think? Are there situations where you think using a shield wall with muskets makes sense? Are there situations where you think it doesn't make sense? Put your response down in the comments below. Have a great day.